This is the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom show, The Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carrboro, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10 p.m., Friday morning at 6 a.m., or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Iris Schwinzer, here with our host, Lori Hoyt, and Emily are here on the camera. Today our special guest is Tye Hunter.
Thanks, Iris. We're glad to be here again on another beautiful Wednesday afternoon, and I'm very happy the air conditioning is working quite well today. We're never quite sure, but that makes a big difference to me, more than to some people maybe. Anyhow, we're delighted to be here, and we're delighted that Tye Hunter could join us today. And he's somebody I've known for a long time, not real well, but I've known him and known he's been doing good work for years. And so we're going to hear about his good work that he's doing for our state and our community. And welcome, Tye.
It's very nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think when I first called you, I had heard from Lucy that you were taking on a case and she didn't think you'd be able to come this Wednesday. So I think we'll start off and just hear about that, since it's the most immediate thing that you've been dealing with, and while it's fresh in your mind. I have no idea what it was about, but I'd love to hear.
Yeah, it's actually is very interesting. On Monday and Tuesday, there were actually 6 different death penalty cases. Those were cases involved people who were on death row in North Carolina. 5 of them were black men, and there was 1 Native American woman, and they were all there because of a law that was passed way back in 2009 called the Racial Justice Act. And so this was, 2009, if you'll recall, was the last throes of our democratically controlled legislature. So we had Democrats in the House and the Senate, and we had a Democratic governor at that time. And so in that year, they passed something called the Racial Justice Act, and the purpose of that law was to permit people who were on death row to present information, data, evidence, whatever they had, to see whether race had played some impermissible role in them being prosecuted, convicted, sentenced to death. And so people were allowed a year to do research. And so one of the things that happened was that 2 women who were professors at Michigan State University School of Law came down and did a huge study. And there were lots of volunteers working on it. They did a huge study on all of the death penalty trials between 1990 and 2010. And one of the things they looked at was jury selection, to see whether there were patterns of race discrimination in jury selection. Well, so they did this study. The legislature had allowed people on death row 1 year to make a filing. So they had a year to try and gather evidence, and then they had to file 1 year after the passage of the bill. So in 2010, everybody on death row who was interested had to be ready to file something. So these scholars from Michigan State University, sent students, law students, all kind of people out all over the state and all the different county courthouses to collect information about who was on the jury in all of these, in about 150, I think it's more like 170 death penalty trials. And so they collected all the data, and then they analyzed it, and they came back and they found, I guess it's not terribly surprising, that in fact there was significant race discrimination statewide, and in all the different places where we have death penalty prosecutions. And so that evidence was presented in the filings that these these death row inmates did. And so I was involved in getting the legislature to pass that legislation. I was involved in helping with the research, and then I was involved in helping to file, along with lots of other lawyers, these claims. And I think it ended up being about 140 cases. And so after we had filed, the next step was, to try and get a hearing in front of a judge. And so we ended up going, the first hearing was in Fayetteville, North Carolina in 2011. And that was in front of Judge Greg Weeks, who was the resident Superior Court judge for the 12th Judicial District, which is basically Cumberland County, which Fayetteville is the biggest city down there. So we went down there and had about a 3-week hearing, and then after a month or so of deliberations, Judge Weeks decided in favor of that first defendant, whose name was Marcus Robinson. And then after that, we went back and had another hearing where we joined 3 other Cumberland County defendants together and had another hearing in front of Judge Weeks, where Judge Weeks again found in favor of the 3 defendants that there was race involved in the jury selection, and so he overturned all 4 of these death verdicts. And under the statute, what happened if they found that race was involved in your death sentence is they just changed your sentence from the death penalty to life, and so that was the result. But the state, the Attorney General's office, the District Attorney's office down there appealed the case up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And during this time, we had the big election of 2010. The legislature flipped over. And at the same time, really our state Supreme Court became more and more Republican also, because as you all know, we elect our judges, and they're basically in partisan. Every once in a while they take the labels off, but everybody knows who's a Republican, who's a Democrat. So we basically have always had partisan election of judges. And so both our Supreme Court and our legislature got much more conservative while we were in the middle of doing this. And so in 2012, the legislature amended the Racial Justice Act to try and make it harder for people to get relief. And then in 2013, they repealed the Racial Justice Act. And in the meantime, our case was on appeal up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. So the 4 cases went up for the first time to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and we had arguments, and they decided that even though the state had exactly the same amount of time to prepare as we had, that the state hadn't had enough time to prepare for the hearing, and so they vacated Judge Weeks' orders and said, we're going to send it back for another hearing. And of course, as soon as we got down there, what the prosecutors wanted wasn't another hearing. They wanted the judge to dismiss it because it had been repealed now by the Republican legislature, and so the judge did dismiss it. So then we trudged back up to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and of course what's happened is our legislature is still, as we well know, very much controlled by the Republicans, but we have a Democratic governor, and the Supreme Court has actually changed a significant amount since the last time we were there, and it's now 6 Democrats and 1 Republican. And so we went up there to argue about what the effect of this repeal of the Racial Justice Act was on these 4 cases who'd already won once, and then all these other people who hadn't even had a chance to have a hearing. They had filed, they were ready to have hearings, but they hadn't had hearings yet. And so we heard 6 cases, 5 on Monday and then 1 on Tuesday morning, that were basically all about that question.
Wow. So you've been with it from the beginning.
Yeah, so I know that was a long answer, but that's 10 years of my life.
Wow. And all of their lives are at stake.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So this is life and death work.
Well, and not only that, but what the Michigan State study found was that there is discrimination against qualified black jurors across the state. It was bad in 1990. It was just as bad in 2010. The odds of being sent off the jury by a prosecutor increase by about 2.5 times if you're black. That's the statewide average. To give you an analogy or a comparison that we sometimes use, the odds ratio for the connection between smoking and heart disease is 1.54. And I would say most people accept the fact that there's a connection between smoking and heart disease. Well, the connection between prosecutors kicking you off this jury and you being black was 2.5.
Wow.
So it's very powerful in terms of statistics. And of course, this was based on hundreds of jurors because we had the power of bringing all these cases together. Now, it has been unconstitutional to discriminate against people on the basis of race in jury selection for more than 100 years, almost 150 years. In the post-war civil rights acts that the Congress passed post-Civil War, you know, one of the things they passed was trying to protect, black people's right to vote, black people's right to participate on juries, because if you think about sort of what are the biggest responsibilities and in a way powers of citizenship, it's really voting and serving on a jury. Not that people particularly want to serve on a jury. I realize lots of people are not wildly enthusiastic when they get that summons saying it's their time to serve on the jury. But especially in a capital case, if you think about it, you're probably never going to have, unless you're a physician or someone in a very unusual position, you're never going to have that much power over literally the life of somebody else. Wow. As you do when you're on that jury. Yeah. And of course, what we know from history is that the government, the state, North Carolina, has never really wanted black people at the levers of power. And so we have suppressed the vote for black people ever since the Civil War has been over. It's still going on now, as we know. And the same thing has happened with their jury service. And although our study was about capital cases, there's also been another recent study by a law professor at Wake Forest who looked at every trial in North Carolina, I think it was in 2011, and he found almost exactly the same thing, that black people were about twice as likely, a little more than twice as likely, to be excused from juries as white people. And so, we have this powerful evidence, and of course some places are worse than other places, but I would just say there's no place where there's a significant number of black people where there's not discrimination. There are places where there's so few black people that you can't, it's almost impossible to tell. Some of the states up in the West, there are very few African Americans who live there, and so it's harder to make out a case. But when you're able to look over a 20-year period, the pattern is like unmistakable.
Yeah.
And so we had some very powerful evidence, and then of course we get discovery. Judge Weeks gave us discovery, and so we got to look into the prosecutor's files in a lot of these cases, which we'd never been able to do before. And
this is just recently.
This is through this Racial Justice Act
then.
litigation of the last, I would say, last 5 years. And so we found amazing things where the state, you know, both sides get a list, they find out who's going to be called for jury service. And one thing the state did several times is they would go to local law enforcement and get several people from law enforcement in the room with them and go over the jurors and say who's a good juror and who's a bad juror. And the way it ran with race was like, it was just simply amazing. You know, oh, this person's from a high crime neighborhood, which of course means black neighborhood. Or this person is a thug, you know, that's a black person. And this person, you know, some white person who's been in trouble a few times, and he's described as a ne'er-do-well, he'll be okay. So it's just amazing how the judgments were so skewed by race. And so it wasn't just the statistics, but we found other things.
It was right there in the data.
Yeah, it was right in the data and also in the files of these prosecutors, who of course are, you know, furious at even the suggestion that you know, that they would do anything racially discriminatory. Because one thing that has happened that's changed, when I was a little boy growing up in Greensboro, I think most white people, you know, they were not ashamed to say that they thought white people were better than black people. I don't think that was a controversial statement when I was a child in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, my parents were not mean people. They did not use the N-word. They were not mean to, you know, they did not hate black people. But if you ask them, did they think they were as good as white people? You know, that was like, you know, that's like saying, is gravity real or something, you know?
Yeah.
And of course,
it was so taken for granted.
It was so taken for granted, and that was the life. I didn't even have to think about that. I grew up, I'm a little boy. I can see the social arrangement. I can see who's on top and who's on the bottom. You know, it didn't take, no one had to tell me anything.
Yeah.
Because I saw it.
And you think it's because of something about them,
right,
that they are in your neighborhood either to pick up their trash or to be a servant in the house, or, you know, and you see the white people having positions of professional
right
jobs and things, and you just think that's how it is. Is some people deserve, you know, it's the way things are.
Right. The only black lawyer I think I ever saw as a child was the guy who played a black lawyer on Amos and Andy, and of course he was like presented as a buffoon and a crook and an idiot, and so but that, you know, that's all I knew. And so now as I got to be a little older, you know, I learned more and things changed. But so one thing that has changed is now respectable white people do not feel like it's okay to say, I prefer white people to black people. They say, oh no, I treat everybody the same. I don't even see color.
Yeah.
And whatever. And so that has changed, which I think is good.
Yeah.
But it sort of makes it harder to get at the truth.
Yes. Yes.
Because now it's not considered polite to be a racist. But in a lot of ways, people haven't changed their views as much as they like to think that they have changed their views.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the age of Trump, more people are feeling they don't have to be polite and don't have to, you know, we're talking about the change in the mores and what was accepted as, of course, the way it is, and now people are much more conscious of it's crude and rude to talk racist, but with Trump, the sad thing...
Well, even that's taken a step. I mean, I never thought I would see real Ku Klux Klan people in their pointy hats and their white robes in Orange County.
I know. That was a shock. In spite of everything else, Saturday, I didn't find out about that because I was busy all weekend until yesterday.
I mean, in a way, they're sad clowns, but still, there they are. They exist. Those are breathing people. They, you know, they live somewhere within driving distance of here, and there they are.
Yeah.
Gather. I mean, so it is. It is like something's coming out of the woodwork a little bit.
It sure is. Well, I mean, if you grew up in Greensboro, I moved here in the 60s, and I remember the Klan marching in Raleigh and going with our family as a protest, and how scary it was, you know, and how shocking it was. And I don't know if you remember it, but they were not afraid to march in the streets.
Oh, no. Well, and, you know, Reverend Barber and other people have made the same point, is that, you know, in America's history about race and about lots of things has always been sort of there as progress, and then there's a reaction to that progress, and then there's progress, and then there's a reaction to that progress. And so there was the Civil War, which brought the end of slavery, and then there was a short period in North Carolina where we really almost had a democracy.
It was a lot of hope, a lot of optimism for that.
And that we actually had black people were serving in the legislature, and then of course there's a reaction to that. You know, some people decided
a very strong backlash.
Yes,
to that.
And so. You know, and so I think, you know, when Brown v. Board of Education was passed, you know, it's interesting to look at history when, you know, you look at all these Confederate monuments that are all over the country, and even battle flags, the Confederate battle flags being flown, you know, at state capitals in the South. If you go back and look and say, when did that happen? A lot of it happened after the Reconstruction had been beat back by the South, and then they put up these Confederate monuments, really as not a monument so much to what happened 50 or 60 years before in the Civil War, but to a monument of their sort of regaining their white Southern pride, and you know, and of course our little silent Sam, and now invisible Sam, is a great example of that, because if you look at the speech that was made on the day that monument was put up, it's like unmistakable that you know that wasn't the subtext, that was the text, was really white supremacy.
That was a vicious speech about beating a black woman.
Yes, and so, and then you look around the country and you see that date, and then also after Brown v. Board of Education was decided in 1954, you know, desegregating the schools, supposedly, then Confederate flags start popping up in state capitals. So, you know, it does have to do with history, but it's a very specific history that seems, you know, to get these things up. Now, I'm not saying there aren't people who are mixed up and sentimental, who, you know, that's not the main thing for them. But if they look at the history, that is the main thing. You know, it's just like, you know, maybe you collect Nazi memorabilia, you know, for some other weird reason, but that has a specific meaning to 99.9% of us. So I don't even know how we got on this subject now, but
well, we're talking about, you know, what happened in your court case, and we went from that what's happened in society.
Well, yes, and sort of things are coming out.
Progress and backlash, and progress, and it's been a seesaw all through our history, and in our country's history, even before the Civil War.
Right.
Yeah, it's and when you look back at, you know, how we learned about the Revolution and these wonderful Jefferson and all these founders, and then now we more and more hear about their slaveholding, and you know what's so disillusioning with Jefferson is not only that he was a slaveholder, but that his mistress, Sally Hemings, he never freed her or the children he made with her. You know, bad enough to be a slaveholder, some of them had the grace to free some people.
To free their children.
To free their children, and some people they were intimately involved with.
Yes.
But Jefferson, that is
No.
just so.
Well, I think we just have to say Jefferson was a very talented person, a very talented person, but also a deeply flawed person.
Yeah.
And I think that's true for lots of humans, and certainly for some of our founding fathers. Really, slavery. I don't think we probably would have had a successful revolution without slavery. I think slavery was so important to building wealth in our early country. I think people think that it was just something that happened down some dusty roads in Alabama or something, but it was the engine.
The economic engine for North and South.
Yes, for North and South,
and we
and
didn't know
Europe.
that. And Europe. And God, you're mad at Europe. I didn't. Okay, but that's just in recent years that I realized about the North and where these, Ivy League universities are now facing their past. I mean, it's just.
Which it is it is amazing that the story has been kept quiet.
Yes.
For so long, but it is nice that it's coming out now. Not that there aren't people who don't want to shut their ears or think you're un-American, or you have to put that in context, or whatever people want to say. And I agree you have to put it in context.
Yeah.
And the context is, this is who we are. This is how we got to be who we are. That's the context, and we need to deal with it. And this. What I've been working on is just a little tiny sliver of that as it reflects the criminal justice system. One thing that I have often said about the criminal justice system, there is a reason we have the kind of punitive criminal justice system we have in the United States, and it's because it was really designed with black people in mind. Now, lots of poor white people end up being collateral damage, and nobody much cares about them. But the reason our criminal justice system is so different from England's and Germany's and France's and Italy's and all these places where other white, if you go and look at all the other white countries in the world, we have by far the most punitive, the least progressive, the least interested in sort of returning people to the society and trying to improve them. It's like we stand alone. It's us, and it's North Korea, and it's Iran, and it's Russia. It's really, but the reason for that, of course, is race.
So we're going to come back to that. It's time that we're going to take a station break. This is such a timely and important topic and things that we're talking about, Tye.
This is Will's Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carrboro 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
Okay, I don't know if either of you have any announcements. I just want to let people know that AT&T wireless workers were on strike for a few days, and the Raging Grannies and Will were making plans to go and support the strikers who are in different locations all over Chapel Hill and the area, and just found out, at least I just found out this morning, that it's been suspended, not settled, but they suspended the strike because they are re-entering negotiations. Mm-hmm. So there's hope that because AT&T was not willing to be very fair at all, so it sounds like there may be some hope for that. If anybody pay attention, these were wireless union workers, and this is a right-to-work state, so we don't have too many union workers, so it's really important that we support any efforts by labor to have some power and strength in this state. So if anybody's interested, you can contact the AFL-CIO and and try to get word to Mary B. McMillan, who sent word out about it. That's in Raleigh, the North Carolina AFL-CIO, and to let them know that we want to show solidarity and support. You may also want to communicate the Communication Workers of America, the CWA, that's the union, that we're supporting the workers. So that's important. We're having Labor Day this weekend, and this is a very interesting piece of labor news that we want to pay attention to. And if they have to go back on strike, be prepared to support them. The other piece of really good news is that Greta Thunberg, the young 16-year-old Norwegian young person, teenager, arrived today on Coney Island in a 60-foot fast sailboat, and she crossed the ocean that way because she is protesting the use of flying in planes due to the huge amount of pollution that they emit, the CO2. And so this is her way to not only talk the talk but walk the walk, actually sail the ocean. 2 weeks on the ocean in a sailboat with a small crew of 3 or 4, I think, and I'm sure her family.
Boy, that's a pretty quick.
Yeah, that's what I just heard on the radio. Now, I'm not going to vouch for the accuracy, but that's what I heard on. And she's coming here by such unusual means, sailing here, because there's going to be a UN conference on climate crisis. And I think many of you may know who I'm talking about, Greta Thunberg. But if you're not sure, she is this young person who has inspired school kids and young people all over the world to protest about the climate from their classrooms and in front of legislatures, because they are fighting for the right to be able, as they grow older, to be able to breathe the air and to have a world that they can live in. And they say, we're the ones that your actions, you're falling down on the job of leaving us a viable world. And so they're taking action. And so it's very exciting that she's inspiring so many young people, and of course some of us older people too. So I wanted to put out that piece of information. And I think that's about all the news. Stay tuned for both of those things. Climate crisis, we'll have more information in subsequent shows. We always try at least a couple times a month to have something on about the climate or the environment. And we're going to get back to our guest, Tye Hunter, who's just back from an important court case for the last 2 days that goes back some years to the Racial Justice Act of 2009. And when the new legislature came in 2010, by 2013 they did away with it. And there was some beginnings that came about then. A judge threw out some of the death sentence sentences, and then when it was thrown out, they were put back, I guess, on death row. Yes. And
they've been off death row for 3 years, and the state had them brought back and put back on death row.
On death row. Talk about punitive and not wanting to give a chance to even let those few cases play out, because I think you said there was 140 cases that were researched that had racial bias, and then that was squelched when they did away with the racial.
Well, they're trying to squelch it, and so one of the issues before the Supreme Court was, does that violate our Constitution, either our state Constitution or the federal Constitution? Because people are entitled to due process. People, if they are given a right, whether by statute or by the Constitution or by anything, there are rules about when and if you can take that right back away. Here, you'll enjoy this. One of the interesting cases we looked at was an old case that I will bet none of you have ever heard of. and it's called State v. Keith. Have you ever heard of Colonel Keith?
No, I have not.
Colonel Keith was a guy, we're going back to the Civil War again, he was a Confederate colonel, and there was an attack way out in the western part of the state in Marshall on a Confederate place. I think they were keeping salt there. They were storing salt there, which back in those days, salt was incredibly important for preserving food, and so that you could keep the troops alive. And so there had been a raid by some of the local civilians on this supply place. I think it was salt, but I'm not sure about that, in Marshall. And so in retribution for that raid, Colonel Keith led a party of Confederate soldiers, and they gathered. They got kids and women who were there and tortured them to try and get information out of them. And then they gathered up 13 men who were too old to serve in the service, and then little boys who were too young to serve in the service, and they killed them.
Oh.
They massacred them. This happened in North Carolina during the Civil War. They massacred these 13 civilians in to pay back. I've seen movies, where the Nazis did this, where someone would do something in a town and they would go out and kill 10 people.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't originate that idea.
So these were soldiers?
These were Confederate soldiers who killed these civilians, older men and boys, people who were not within the age of conscription, and they killed them.
They're compatriots. And
so, up in the mountains, everyone wasn't necessarily for the Confederacy up in our North Carolina. No, but it was fellow North Carolinians. They were not combatants.
Yeah.
I mean, it was clearly a massacre, and so this became known, and people were upset about it. And so, when the Civil War was over, the legislature, which was still at that point controlled by the, basically pro-slavery, pro-secessionist Democratic Party, passed a General Amnesty Act. And they said anybody who committed any crime during the Civil War that had to do with, you taking orders from a superior, or you defending your home, or there were a whole list of things. And they basically said, if you're charged with a crime, and you can show, that it was connected to, something you were doing during wartime, then we're going to forgive you for that, and that's going to stop the prosecution. And so that was passed, I think, in 1866. And then in 1869, by then, the Reconstruction was in full bloom, and we had a different we actually had a constitutional convention, and they wrote a new constitution, and they also made law, which they were permitted to do as a constitutional convention. And one of the things they did was repeal that 1866 Amnesty Act in 1869. And then a short time after that, Colonel Keith was brought to trial up in the county where he had ordered these soldiers to massacre these 13 civilians, and they convicted him, but he pled under this old Amnesty Act, and it went to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and the North Carolina Supreme Court said once the legislature gave him that right, and gave all of these people under the right, it's an undefined class of people who may have committed crimes as part of the war, that once the legislature gave them that right, they could not then come back and take it away. And that's what the North Carolina Supreme Court said in almost 150 years ago. And so, I'd never heard of this case.
No.
But when we were doing our research on what happened with the Racial Justice Act, where it was passed and these death row prisoners had a right that if they could show that race was involved in their case, and then they could get off death row. We said, it's kind of the same thing. And so when we were up in the Supreme Court on Monday and Tuesday, it's all about Colonel Keith.
Oh my gosh.
Because that case has never been reversed. That case has, it's still good law. It was actually cited in a California case and cited in the U.S. Supreme Court fairly recently. And so we said, well, if it's good enough for someone who massacred 13 people, who's a Confederate soldier, it ought to be good enough for these black men and Native American women who are on death row, who race was involved in their case. And so, it's a great irony, that's the case.
It certainly is.
And of course, that's what we said to the court. We said to the court, to say that this law that protected Colonel Keith from answering to the law for massacring 13 people as a Confederate officer, now you've decided it's no good when it comes to protecting black and brown men and women who are on death row in North Carolina. I said, that's not really a good look. And so we had that's just one of the things that we were talking about. But I think it's safe to say that we talked more about race in the state Supreme Court than has been talked about in 50 years in the state Supreme Court. So we just had case after case where we were talking about the facts of our individual cases and what we had to show that race discrimination had played a crucial role in it, and then talked about what the legislature did and why they did it. Another interesting thing to us is, the Fourth Circuit decided that one of our gerrymandering cases was unconstitutional because they did it had a racial impact. And there was some evidence that they did it race consciously, and that violates the Constitution. And so the Fourth Circuit said, well, that law, that particular gerrymandering law, is no good because it violates the Constitution, because it has a racial impact and the legislature's intended for it to have a racial impact. And of course we have argued it's the same thing with the repeal of the Racial Justice Act, that here is
blatant.
We had a bill that was intended to be, to help correct some of the mistakes we've made about race over the years, and then 4 people get relief, and like one of the Michigan State scholars, Dr. Barbara O'Brien, she came up and testified to the legislature before they repealed it to tell them about, what she had found and what was there. And so they were fully aware of what the study showed and how much race had played a role in these things, and then they still repealed it. And so we said, this looks a lot, and it was the same legislator. It was the same legislature. And so we said, this looks like the same analysis would apply. If they are doing this to disadvantage a class of people that are disproportionately black and brown, that's a violation of the Constitution, just like. So we had a very interesting, and I thought sort of powerful, emotionally powerful couple of days of talking about this at the state Supreme Court.
Well, so you laid out your case, but there hasn't been a decision yet.
Oh no, and it will be months before we have a decision. It's just like the U.S. Supreme Court. You might argue in October, and they might decide it in April.
Yeah.
And so we don't know when they'll decide it. And the U.S. Supreme Court, they try to decide everything by July 1st, because then they scatter to the 4 winds for a couple of months. But the North Carolina Supreme Court, there's no time limit. So it could be 90 days, it could be a year.
Yeah.
So we're just waiting. But you know, I feel very good about the, you know, the argument we had.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll see what happens. But I did learn some North Carolina history that, you know, I grew up here. I thought, well, that was one thing I knew pretty well was North Carolina history. But, you know, there are things, especially things people aren't proud of, and they get hidden, and they get hidden fast.
Well, they say that, you know, history is written by the victors, and a lot of that got hidden about. I mean, even in the North, I remember having a very short thing about Reconstruction, and what I remember from it is about the carpetbaggers and the scalawags.
Right.
And, you know, and this was in the North, so the history was very poorly written and very selectively written.
No, I think at some point the North decided they had shed enough blood for black people.
Yeah.
And they were done. And
Yeah.
then whatever arrangement the white power structure worked out in the South, they were fine with it, and that lasted for almost 100 years.
Yeah. Well, I'm just started. My daughter got the book for me, Stony the Road.
Oh yeah.
By Henry Louis Gates. I want to recommend it to anybody who has not heard of it, and it is a wonderful, very readable history of Reconstruction, and it's I've just gotten started. I'm on page 20, but it's just packed with so many anecdotes and ways, things that we just didn't know, and he's got, you know, very, very extensive detail.
Yeah.
And
actually, our history is a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
Than the pablum they gave us. And you know, it's just not a coherent, straight story of one hero, and I use the masculine on purpose, one hero after another, you know, saving us for democracy. That's not really the way any society moves, and that's certainly not the way the United States has moved.
No.
And, so we're exceptional, but we're not exceptional in the ways that people like to think we're exceptional. In a way, every country's exceptional.
Well, they said it wasn't until the 1960s that some historians started taking another look at what had been promulgated as the history of Reconstruction.
Right.
And that there was then revisionist history. So again, depends who's writing the history. And that was the beginning of another way of presenting it. So, you know, two different historians from two different periods could have a whole different way of looking at it, and it's very interesting. And thank goodness they mentioned Eric Foner as one of the main historians who had a major revisionist history of what was happening at that time. So well, good for you guys for going, and it's just in 2 days you could present all the arguments. I thought you might have to go for.
Well, we filed hundreds of pages of argument in writing, and thousands of pages of records, and so there is more there than any poor law clerk for one of those justices will ever want to read through. And so, but I think, you know, you try in an appeal, you know, to give people the essence of it, and to let them know, you know, what we think ought to be the next step. And so, yeah, we can't. So yeah, we could. You could tell. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time.
It's been fascinating.
And there's a lot to talk about.
There's a lot to talk about.
I mean, it really is just part of, you know, a part of our history, and fits in so well with you know, analysis in other areas. It's sort of the same story, you know, whether you're talking about schools, whether you're talking about economic power, whether you're talking, you know, whatever you're talking about, you can see how, you know, how race has been used not only against black people, but against poor white people.
Yeah.
I mean, that's really
the tragedy too.
One sentence history of the South is how poor white people have, you know, and blacks, people have done, elite whites have done everything they can to keep that group that has so much in common, so much economic interest. You know, you talk about we don't have very many, you know, organized labor in North Carolina. There's a reason for that, and one of the most powerful reasons is race.
And North Carolina, for those who don't know, has a very bloody history of where they tried to have unions, the textile strikes.
Yeah.
You know, that could be another 5 programs I recommend reading up, because there's a reason that the unions failed here, because they were so bloodily put down. It was vicious. It was vicious.
And another thing they would do is tell these white Southerners, you know, lint heads, say, you know, these Yankees that are coming down here to unionize you, they're going to make, you know, you're going to have to work with black people. You know, your big social advantage you have
is that you're not black.
Is that you're not. It's like Dr. Martin Luther King. He was quoting someone else. He said, you know, the poor white Southerners, children's bellies are shriveling, and he feeds them Jim Crow.
Ooh. Oh wow!
And it's so true.
Yeah. That
whites were complete suckers. Poor whites, which was the great majority. The great majority. The great majority never had a slave. But they so bought into this idea that at least we're better.
Yeah.
Than black people, better than slaves, and then better than former slaves, and that's enough. You don't have to pay me a living wage. You don't have to do anything for me, as long as
I'm considered a white man.
As long as I'm considered white, and that's important, and that I can look down on all these multitudes, and so that's kind of the story.
Well, that was the
post-war South.
A dream a lot of times of any progressive movements or labor movements was that fusion idea. That if you could get the poor blacks and whites working together, then you would have a really powerful...
They'd run the South. They'd run the South.
Yeah.
I mean, right now it's true.
And it's true.
But there are forces that, spend millions of dollars and have, spilled blood, done everything they could do to keep that from happening, and so far they've succeeded.
Well, and Wilmington was a great example where there was temporarily a wonderful fusion movement, and they were working together, and white terrorists
drove them out
by massacring them. So it's a bloody history, but thank you. There's always been some good people, some angels who are each part of that history, trying to rise above that racial divide and try to get people working together, and it's a worthwhile project to keep trying.
Well, I don't think you were referring to me as an angel. You can ask quantity. I assure you that's not true.
I'm just saying. Well, I'm just saying. Yeah, that was maybe.
But it has been one of my colleagues yesterday after we were finishing up. He shook his head. He says, "I can't believe we get paid to do this because it was such a pleasure."
Yeah.
To do. And so.
So you did have people working with you on.
Yes. I'm a very small part of a
powerful team
of a big group of people.
Well, that's the only reason I think the world is still going on, is that there's, in every generation, there's always some people working for the better good, and angels may be really only a slight exaggeration. They may not have wings, but in terms of their work and their intent to work for the general good, in spite of sacrificing things for themselves, is what's kept the world going on.
And I do feel like there's a connection between all of these struggles.
Absolutely.
And that the more we can understand them and support them across, because it's in a lot of ways it's the same story of rich people wanting to be rich at the and really that's the story of slavery too, was that some people wanted to be rich And so that's why we had to say it wasn't that they said, I want to enslave some people just for the fun of enslaving some people. It's about money.
It was about
It's
money.
always about money.
And it still is about money.
And it's still about money.
So our time is up. I want to thank, I should have been mentioning your name more often. We've been talking to Tye Hunter, who is, we're so lucky to have him today. He's just back from 2 days of a court hearing, trying to reinstate or redo this taking away of the Racial Justice Act and the people who have been hurt by taking it away and fighting for them. And do you think there's any chance of getting it reinstituted?
Yes. Yes,
That's what you're fighting for?
I'm hopeful. That was, one of the things we said was this repeal it should be erased because it was based on race and it's unconstitutional.
And there are all those other cases.
And at the least, you can't go under the Keith case. You can't go back and take away from the 140 people who filed, what they filed for. Colonel Keith, he didn't even plead the amnesty statute until after it had already been repealed. We got 140 people that all pled it while it still existed, and then once they'd made their showing, it got taken away from them. And so, so I think we're very hopeful that those people who represent not everybody, but almost everybody on death row will get their day in court. But you never know, because this, like so many things, is subject to the whims of history and the pressures of politics, and where that's going to be 6 months from now.
But you do right now have a fairer court.
Yes. Oh, I think we probably have the best court that the best Supreme Court that North Carolina has ever had right now.
So let's get a lot of things going to
Yes.
that court as soon as we can.
Yes.
Thank you, Tye
Sure.
Hunter.
You're welcome. My pleasure.